Hi everyone and welcome to the Curious Geographer. Super excited to have you here. If you are new to my channel, don't forget to hit subscribe. And on here there is can you see my hands? There's kind of events which are coming up, and this is our last one for this term. So we have already talked to the UK School Sustainability Network, volunteering for migrants in Greece, and also how to save the planet. With some of our live interviews, so definitely check those ones out. But today I'm super excited that we are going to be talking about what is decarbonisation. Can we decarbonise society with Dr. Richard Waller, who is Senior Lecturer in Physical Geography and Geography and Missions Tutor at the University of Keele. He's going to tell you a bit about his interests, but his main interests are in physical geography, and we're going to find out how he first got into that and excited about kind of studying about glaciers, and how he's moving his interest at the moment is looking at decarbonisation, which is our focus for today. So if I pass over to Richard, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself to us and telling us a little bit about what you do.
Hi, thank you very much. It's an absolute pleasure to have an opportunity to be involved in the event tonight. And thank you again for everyone for joining us. So my name is Richard. I've been a passionate geographer throughout my life, and it's geography in general, but certainly physical geography really kind of captured my interest when I was doing my GCSEs and A levels. So I was lucky enough to then do an undergraduate degree in geography, then went and did a sort of PhD focusing on glaciology and glacial landscapes, and that saw me then going through and doing a sort of like a postdoc, which kind of cemented my interest in glacial environments, but also permafrost environments, which we will probably talk about at some stage. And then I've been at Keele for the last 20 years, which has recently developed a real interest and a bit of a reputation in kind of sustainability, and the kinds of the various stages that we need to approach the decarbonisation of society. And I really have seen me undergoing a bit of a transition in my kind of career, which will probably become quite apparent in some of the topics that we'll end up talking about today.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for that great introduction. And I'm looking forward to asking you later about kind of your first interest in geography, which we'll kind of talk about advice at the end for future geographers and going up kind of through education as well. So we're going to focus at the moment on a recent area of interest for you, and that is about decarbonising society, and we're going to talk about transport as well. So can we first start off by saying, what do we actually mean when we say decarbonising society?
I mean, there were some interesting conversations about this on kind of Twitter before the event, and clearly we can't get rid of every last kilogram of carbon out of society's emissions. But in terms of talking about decarbonising society, the focus really is about reducing the carbon emissions relating as far as possible relating to all of society's activities. And I think that we can see that most graphically in terms of the extraordinary transitions we've seen in the ways in which we generate electricity, in particular, and power in general. There's been these extraordinary changes in the space of 20 years as we've moved away from an electricity grid which was dominated by coal, to one where certainly in days when we have sort of windy conditions can be dominated by renewables. So dramatic changes there. So the ways in which we heat and light up our homes, the ways in which we travel, the choices we make in terms of what we eat, the choices we make in terms of what we consume and where we consume that from, and then ultimately what we do with that, all some of those key aspects of our society and our economy, where there's those fabulous opportunities to reduce the carbon emissions associated with those activities, as well as yield some other really exciting co-benefits as well.
Fantastic. And the big question, which kind of is a framing today, and I know you've got some really interesting images to show and slides to kind of go with this, is why is it important to decarbonise society?
Because I guess we've all become very aware in recent years in terms of just how dramatic and how immediate the ongoing climate crisis and the climate emergency is. And I think for me, it was probably about 3 or 4 years ago that I went to a number of talks that really brought home to me, this is not a future issue. This is a now issue. And when we end up looking at the potential impacts of that, then they're becoming more extreme, more stark, and harder for people to ignore. So we've seen extremes of heat from around the world. It was a couple of years ago or so that we had temperatures that were above 38 degrees C, 100 degrees Fahrenheit in old money for the Arctic for the first time. And you're talking about records which were being broken by 6 degrees, not just small increases in temperature, but dramatic increase in those extreme temperatures. And we've seen, the impacts of that in terms of extensive forest fires and so-called mega fires in various different locations around the world, in Australia, in the Mediterranean, in California. We've seen the impacts of that in terms of severe flood events within Europe, within the UK, of course, as elsewhere. But I think it's the concerns related to global to potential climatic tipping points, which is the area of most significant kind of concern for human society and the scientists working within that field, which includes, of course, a number of geographers. And if we end up looking at the sort of like the tipping points, then it's interesting that they relate to a variety of different key aspects of our amazing natural world. And of course, there's a coverage last week in terms of the impacts on the Amazon rainforest, for example. But in terms of my own interests, in terms of polar environments and the cold parts of the world, the global cryosphere, the parts of the world which are dominated by ice, it's the tipping points associated with the recession and potentially the collapse of the last remaining ice sheets on Earth, if we think about West Antarctica and Greenland in particular, and the potential for several meters of sea level rise with calamitous consequences for those occupying small island states within the South Pacific coastal locations, coupled with the impacts on permafrost regions. I mean, let's not forget as well, permafrost, they're probably not environments which are all that well known by people at large. Typically, they end up being the Cinderella compared to glacial environments. But permafrost environments occupy 24% of the land surface area of the Northern Hemisphere. It's a huge area. And I always liken it to it's like someone's, it's a very large freezer. Why do we put stuff in freezers? We put it in there to stop the organic matter decomposing. So it's like we've left the freezer door open. That organic matter that's locked up within permafrost environments is starting to decompose. And what do you release when you decompose organic matter? You release a combination of carbon dioxide and methane, both of which are potent greenhouse gases. So there's a risk in those situations of those positive feedbacks, which once triggered to a great degree have that potential to be irreversible. So all of these kinds of things are highlighting this real focus on 1.5 degrees C as the limit that we really don't want to transgress. In order to limit the prospect of those more dramatic consequences of climate change taking place.
Fantastic, and I've just put some of the links of like the tipping points that you've put down there as well. One of your interests is in obviously like glaciers. How is that focus kind of shown in what's happening with glaciers? I was thinking to the articles that you sent over as well that I could show.
Yeah, no, it's interesting that the first time I went to a glacier was in the 1980s or so when I was a young sort of 12-year-old, and since that time period, then pretty much all the glaciers that I've ever been to, and certainly the glaciers I know best are those within Iceland. I just became preconditioned to the fact that every time you go and see a glacier, then it'll have retreated, because that's what glaciers do, they retreat. And it's become progressively more apparent as that rate of recession increases, and becomes really quite profound, certainly with glaciers in Iceland, a number of them starting to retreat really quite rapidly and quite catastrophically into increasingly large lakes, that becomes, ever more apparent. So I think sometimes it's that sense of when it's when the rate of change increases, that suddenly you become much more aware of of those changes that otherwise you might not have noticed on such a sort of profound level. But I think it's interesting that we now get to a situation where it's not just about glacier recession; it's about potentially the complete disappearance of glaciers. And I'm guessing in terms of sort of showing slides at the moment, in terms of the people now sort of erecting memorials to glaciers which have disappeared. And Andrew Stair Magnusson, who's a fabulous guy whose work I'd recommend, who's based out in Iceland, wrote an epitaph to a glacier in Iceland called Ökjökull, which disappeared, lost its status as a glacier, and put this sort of this plaque on there saying, we do acknowledge that this is a consequence of our impacts on the natural environment, and the rapid climatic changes that are taking place. And only you'll know whether we realise this quick enough and to be able to arrest these changes that we're seeing. But yeah, it's the rate of change, and it's the situation where it's now not just glacier loss, but in some glacier recession, but it's glacier loss that really helps to focus your mind in terms of the urgency of the climate. It is a climate emergency. As people say, it should be treated, as such in terms of the changes that we make to society.
So we've talked about what we mean by decarbonising. We've talked about why is it important and the tipping points, as they said, which was really interesting. But how exactly, what does decarbonising look like in your eyes?
I think, certainly if you, one of the things I like about the concept is you can look at it in a variety of different scales. You can look at it in terms of the individual choices that we make ourselves. So I think it's interesting, and I think something which is really important for geography, and I think geography is an obvious host discipline for developing those skills in carbon literacy. That just in the same way that we're very conscious of how much things cost, on a daily basis, and we're used to budgeting. We need to apply the same kind of thinking and decision making to carbon. Knowing about the embedded carbon within things that we eat or the things that we consume, knowing about the relative carbon emissions associated with different transport choices that we make, and thinking about things like energy efficiency. That situation, and thinking, well, if we as an entire global society need to reduce our carbon emissions by 50%, then what would that mean for me, or for my household, or for my school, or for my classroom? How would we deliver those carbon emissions ourselves? So I think carbon literacy is a really good skill set, and ultimately I see this in terms of, we think about how we, as I look around me at my lights and the sort of like the heater beside me, in terms of thinking about how we light and power our homes, and simple things like the transition to LED light bulbs. I think LED light bulbs are something like it's an 80% reduction or something like that in energy consumption for the same amount of light in compared to the halogen light bulbs that we used to have. So sometimes those simple things, which when deployed across the whole nation, can have sort of significant changes. So there's that sort of how we power and light and heat our homes. There are transport options that we'll kind of come to in a moment, and obviously the importance of active transport. Do I need to get in my car? Can I walk or cycle somewhere, or take public transport? The one that always gets me is consumption. In terms of thinking about what we buy, thinking about the carbon footprint in all of those things that we sort of like purchase, and that sort of reducing, reusing, repurposing, things, and potentially things in terms of buying better and buying things, that last. When we think about discussions related to, to fast fashion and other issues like that. And there's probably another one that I've completely forgotten about in that sense. Oh, what we eat, of course. I mean, it's seen as the most important one is our dietary choices. Have massive impacts in terms of the associated carbon emissions, particularly in land use, but also massive issues in terms of their wider environmental footprints in terms of the use of water. That I know it's something that you've covered within I know some of the other interviews you've done on your channel.
Brilliant. And I was going to say, if anybody does have any questions or thoughts on this, please do write it in the chat and let us know on what are your views on maybe like individual actions or government actions and things like that. So definitely, if you have a question, please write it in the chat for us. We've got lots of people joining live. So as you said, we are going to go on to transport, something which is like so fundamental in like our kind of lives and kind of like so like integrated that lots of people feel like they rely on the systems that they currently have. So can we decarbonise transport? How would that work? I know this is one thing that you've been particularly interested in.
Yeah, I guess the simplest thing is across a lot of these spaces, it's a matter of thinking, when you're thinking about transport, it'd be that sort of sense of, almost like, can I travel less? We all like to travel, and I know we're coming out of a sort of like a pandemic, so there's an opportunity to travel. And I don't want to be too sort of, you don't want to be too sort of hard-nosed about this, but sort of thinking about, if I give myself a particular allocation and a carbon footprint of traveling, how do I want to make that? And I think it'd always be a sort of like, if we're thinking about co-benefits, if rather than sort of jumping in the car and driving, I think I can't remember exactly what the statistics are, but I think, the average journey, there's certainly a significant number of journeys, and we all see this on a daily basis, don't we? Someone thinks, oh, I need to go and get a pint of milk, and they jump in their two-ton SUV and sort of drive, a mile to pick up a 1 litre pint of milk and come back. And about 80% of that energy that they've burnt has gone into heating up the engine block, which then just sort of cools down afterwards, which is, when you think about it, it's just a grotesque waste of energy. So looking at those opportunities to think, well, can I walk or cycle somewhere, or maybe sort of change the ways in which I organize my sort of travel to reduce the carbon footprint would be the key. I think we'd always highlight, and obviously a return to a situation where we're using more in the way of mass transportation systems and public transport. But then in terms of transport more generally, I think something that we're witnessing at the moment, and we're just seeing the start of what's clearly a very rapid transition, is a switch to electric vehicles more generally. So I think the ability to electrify transport and to move transportation away from fossil fuels and the use of petrol and diesel in particular is a central plank of UK and international policy in delivering net zero. And let's not forget the other sort of co-benefits. We think about the other major societal challenges, atmospheric pollution. So I think the World Health Organization estimates it's something like 6 million people in terms of the excess mortality associated with exposure to chronic atmospheric pollution. If we switch to vehicles which are associated with zero tailpipe emissions, at least, then there are some other really important, United Nations strategic development goals that can be really helped by those kinds of changes.
And can you have a chat to us about the different scenarios and what would decarbonising mean if we talk about those kind of climate predictions when we're looking at kind of future scenarios for climate change?
What the sort of changes that we'd need to make in that sense? I mean, certainly in terms of the carbon emissions, then we in order to there's not a single pathway to getting to net zero, but most people will talk about if we want to, we've got a remaining. I've been likened this. It's been likened to sort of like thinking about a pie. There's a certain amount of the pie that you've got left if you want to stay within 1.5 degrees C. And it's a matter of the big wranglings that you have at things like COP26 that, of course, we had last year, was how much of the pie can we have of our own particular nation, the so-called nationally determined contributions. But, to cut to the chase, doesn't, it sounds like a big number, but we've got sort of 400 gigatons of carbon that we can still emit in order to stay. That's our budgets that we've got left to stay within 1.5 degrees C. But to sort of stay within that level, then in terms of the key pathway, then most people will say that globally we need to halve our emissions within the next 10 years. And then we need to reach net zero by 2050. You'll have heard various different nations talking about their plans to reach net zero, in most cases about 2050. And I think the COP26 was the first time that China, as one of the largest, not the largest emission, to kind of talking about sort of 2060. And I think the same with India. So that then ends up being a really major focus. And so and of course we're in a situation at the moment where not only are we're in a situation where we're not reducing them, carbon emissions at the moment are still rising. So we haven't even reached peak emissions yet. So we need to kind of rapidly end up bringing things to at least to level things out, but then to drive those emissions reductions as rapidly as possible, and within the space of the next 8 to 10 years or so. Hence people saying why this is such a a now problem.
We have had a question come in, which I actually think we could just link now, if that's okay, because it kind of links to what we've been talking. So saying, do you think that the public's individual actions in terms of reducing each person's carbon footprint is more important than policy changes and the responsibility of the biggest carbon emitters?
I think they're both really important. Absolutely. I do think we have that ability to affect some. I've been on an all-day session today related to local energy solutions, and I think if there's something that we've learned during the course of the sort of like the pandemic is the importance of community and people sort of re-establishing that sense of community. And I think if there's that ability for people to make to make changes themselves, to kind of communicate that and to assist others in making those changes. One person, it's a rather unfortunate analogy to use, but if we end up looking at it in a similar way, we became used to, the concept of R numbers when we went into the pandemic, and suddenly how rapidly changes can ripple through society in that rather negative way. But if we look at that in a more positive way, if you end up with people making those sort of changes and those cultural shifts and inspiring others to do the same, then you can really get quite rapid, change in society. And I think it also helps in terms of there are certain ways in which we can feel quite powerless in a way to affect changes on certain organizations as much as we'd like to. And we should always, lobby. We do live in a democracy. We should lobby those up the chain to maintain that pressure and identify it as an important electoral issue. But yeah, I certainly those individual changes that we've been making, influencing those around us. I think major organizations, and I think the financial sector in particular is one which can get a lot of stick, but I think is really influential in terms of those investment decisions. And it's remarkable looking at the moment, huge figures that these massive financial organizations that have trillions of dollars worth of assets. I think one of the things which are bizarrely enough, and I'm not, to say I'm not an economist would be an understatement, is that the way in which that investment capital, which is absolutely, fundamental, is rapidly deserting fossil fuels and fossil fuel related high carbon industries, and is flying into to things like renewables and low carbon technologies, because those investors see that those are the areas in which they're going to make those investment returns. And of course we need to influence government in that sense. And whilst things are things are definitely not moving as fast as we would like to, and there needs to be an acceleration in ambition and actually delivery on those targets, it is remarkable, I think, how rapidly the narrative has changed, and how the mainstream all the mainstream political parties and pretty much most, if not all, of the newspapers, who you might not have expected to be the ones kind of talking about this message, are sort of getting behind the need to decarbonize all aspects of society. So a great question, but I think it's going to involve all parts of society and at all different levels acting in concert in order to deliver those changes under those kinds
and
of
thank you very much
timescales.
for asking the question as well. It's always great to have interaction from those watching live. So brilliant. I have a question kind of linked onto that, and I'm not sure whether you might have an answer to this or not, but in talking about maybe places that are successfully making an energy transition, either community size, city size, country size, is there any, or like country level, is there any area that you think is either decarbonising transport effectively, that you maybe know of, that is kind of like a model to follow?
Yeah, I saw some interesting. For people who are interested in this space, then I'd recommend. It's a website, fully charged, a YouTube channel called Fully Charged, which I followed for several years. Which is there's lots of interesting stuff there related to EVs and sort of clean technology. And they sort of featured a few videos around Christmas time based around the city of Utrecht in the Netherlands. And they basically developing a very large sort of city-wide and quite holistic plan that involves a whole series of really interesting changes. The Netherlands, I guess, have always been renowned for their focus on active travel and people traveling around by bike, and that's very much part of their cultural fabric, and completely different to the ways in which we typically travel within the UK. But they're also doing things like developing EV car share schemes, which are related to to new apartments that they're sort of like setting up, so that people don't need, it's not a situation where everyone needs to own a car. They end up having those EV car share schemes. That means that you've got less vehicles, which of course there's a significant embedded carbon associated within those cars, particularly within EVs. But then I think there's some really exciting dimensions to the energy transition in terms of cars. Cars spend the majority of the time sat there doing nothing. But if you think about an electric vehicle, then it's a big battery on wheels. And as we move towards an energy future when we're making more use of renewables, then at the same time, we're going to need more energy storage. So those cars, when they're not being used for transportation, are used for energy storage. So they can be charged up during the course of the day, or during the times when you've got that abundant energy. And then when you've got that deficit of energy, where everyone's coming back from work, rather than turning on gas power plants or anything like that, you just end up drawing down some of that energy from the vehicles. It's what's known as vehicle to grid. You're connecting those vehicles to the energy system, which of course we couldn't do in a situation where we're involved in using liquid fuels. So yeah, there's a series of links. I can kind of share some of those links with you afterwards. That highlight some really interesting opportunities within that particular
Brilliant.
European
That sounds
city.
really interesting. I hadn't heard about I hadn't even thought about the fact that your car kind of sits there for a long time and there's so much other potential that could be used. So thank you for sharing those ideas.
Can
Definitely,
I chip
please
in
do.
on there? Because I think that reminds me in terms of course, if we think about an increase in severe storm events becoming, one of the primary impacts of climate change on the UK. And then, of course, I know you're sort of like yourselves, so anyone in the south of the country in particular, the impacts of Storm Eunice, just a few weeks ago, which is very unusual in terms of a rapidly deepening depression that sort of tracked right across the sort of like the south central part of the UK. And we saw the principal impact of that in terms of, power losses, potentially over several hours, in some cases in terms of several days. And it was interesting in terms of following various people. You've already got electric vehicles who offer what's known as vehicle to load. So you can use your electric vehicle sat on the drive as an energy source. And so those people with those sort of like those vehicles were then, when they lost their power for 7, 8, 9 hours, just sort of plugged their household appliances and everything into their car and then just ran the house for for several hours. And the size of a battery in an EV, you could literally run a house for days off the energy which is stored in an EV battery. So I think they have a role to play in terms of helping provide a more resilient energy infrastructure, and to help deal with the kind of power outages that we've seen on a number of occasions over the course of the winter months.
Fantastic. And if it's possible, I know I asked you this kind of before we went live, but there will be critics, and one of which is the idea that these batteries are very energy intensive to make, or that they are using resources which can cause issues around the world, so extraction of lithium. What would you say about those comments on the negative negative consequences of a kind of energy transition or decarbonising transport?
Yeah, I'd absolutely agree insofar as no technology is a panacea. And if we continue with that more sort of critical perspective, then the automotive industry would like nothing more than from us everyone to kind of exchange our one combustion engine vehicle for a one electric vehicle. And that is clearly not going to be a solution that's consistent with sort of with net zero. We need less vehicles on the road. We need more car sharing. We need more use of active transport. But and a kind of quotation which sort of struck me from, some people might have seen the book by Tom Heap. I can't remember, was it 39 Ways to Save the Planet? And he kind of he mentioned in that we shouldn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. That sort of sense that we are in a situation where it is a climate emergency. So yes, there are always going to be problematic issues associated, particularly with new technologies, but we can't delay the transition that we need to make, and we need to make quite rapidly. If you look at it, then I think there are, I like engineers insofar as they look at problems and they think, well, what's the problem? And what's the solution? So, one of the problems related to battery electric vehicles and their carbon footprint is that they suffer a significant penalty when they're first manufactured, because of the embedded carbon, and particularly the energy that's associated with manufacturing the battery. So if that's a problem, what they're doing is thinking, well, let's involve much more renewable energy in the supply chain that's involved in manufacturing the battery. So you use those, that low carbon energy to produce the batteries, to then reduce their carbon footprint. And in terms of the resources that go into that, then there's nothing inherently wrong with lithium, or with nickel, or with graphite. And I guess we have those choices in the ways in which we look at making sure that we extract those resources in as environmentally and friendly and as an ethical a way as we can. And I think there's some interesting developments in terms of potentially the extraction of lithium from brines in Cornwall, for example. So I think it's really important that whenever we're looking at those sort of supply chains, in the same ethical way that we would look at if we were buying an item of clothing, for example, we should end up being more ethical consumers, hopefully, in that situation, to think, well, where was the where were the resources extracted in manufacturing this in manufacturing that battery. And I do think there are, because we're seeing such a dramatic uptake. I mean, I'm sure everyone on the call has certainly seen that over the course of the last year or two, you've gone from a situation where you might comment and say, oh, there's an electric vehicle. Now they're extremely and going increasingly common, and that is likely to continue over time. He says, as I completely forgotten what the point I was going to make at that stage. Hey ho.
We were just talking about the critiques of it.
Oh yeah, no, it's as the we're going to see a massive sort of technological development in battery technology. I mean, there's a lot of concern about cobalt in batteries, its association with artisanal mining within Democratic Republic of Congo. So now we're generating batteries and new battery chemistries that have no cobalt in them at all. So, you can engineer that out of the supply chain. With lithium, I was watching something just last night that was saying we're looking now potentially, they're now developing the first sodium ion batteries. So rather than using lithium as a charge carrier, you use sodium, and sodium is far more abundant as an element than lithium. And you've already got the testing of those kinds of batteries. So there's nothing inherently wrong with batteries in that sort of sense, but there are ways in which we can make them better. I think from both an ethical and an environmental perspective. But I'm certainly a firm believer if we do want to transition to renewables, and we want to transition to a level of renewables which is required, then along with those intermittent energy sources, we're going to need much more energy storage, and at least part of that energy storage, not all of it, but part of that energy storage is going to come from an increased use of batteries, not just in vehicles, but also potentially in homes as well.
Thank you for answering those. Kind of leading on from what we were talking about earlier on, kind of the initial decarbonising transport and society. So some of your other research and the kind of initial research as you kind of went through your kind of university career focuses on modern and ancient glacial and periglacial environments. So could you first of all tell us, when did you, and I have some images, when did you first become interested in kind of glaciers, and then what does some of your research, what have you researched about glaciers?
Yeah, well, I suppose if my interest in glaciers really stemmed from it probably came a little bit before that, but certainly I know there's this image in terms of myself, my first time I ever saw a glacier, which was when I was on a family holiday to Austria. We went on a coach tour, and we went up to see the Großglockner Glacier the Pasterze Glacier on the Großglockner as the mountain. And I remember, just being blown away by that, and that's one of the great things about geography. There's some of those just amazing wonders of the world that, when we get into the opportunity to go to sort of like field courses, see some of these landscapes or some of these features, they just have such a profound impact on you. And I was just blown away by that. So the opportunity to see that and then wander down and go for a walk over this sort of cordoned off area of the glacier was just one of those sort of like life defining moments. And I've always had part of my interest in geography in general and physical geography in particular has been related to just wandering around the stunning physical landscapes that we have within the British Isles. So wandering around mountainous landscapes, and I found myself asking the question, why does landscape look the way it does? Oh, it's because of the impact of past glaciers and glaciation. So there's always been that kind of connection with the things that I do, for my sort of enjoyment. So doing geography at school was an obvious choice for me, and was always my favorite sort of discipline. And it was when I did my A-levels that I had the opportunity to then go to Iceland. So I know that you got some sort of pictures of a very much younger me when I even still had some hair. When I did, I guess, what was the equivalent of my NEA. I did my A-level project, and I was able to go, and it was just like a 3-week school trip out to Iceland, which again was just was just amazing in terms of that ability. The first time I went to Iceland in 1989. To experience those volcanic and those glaciated landscapes, and to do my project when I was sort of gauging a proglacial stream for a 24-hour period, which was amazing experience. That then sort of meant that it was an obvious thing to go to university to end up doing a geography degree, and it was when I was doing my geography degree that I got an opportunity to do my undergraduate dissertation related to river systems that flow on top of glaciers, superglacial streams. And I did that when I took part in a summer school on the Juneau Icefield in Alaska, and that pretty much cemented my ideas that no, I want to go into academia and into research. So that led me through to a PhD at the University of Southampton, where I did a sort of project focusing on the origin and formation of so-called debris-rich basal ice, which are the sort of like the dirty sediment-rich horizons you get at the base of glaciers and ice sheets that can be really influential in terms of the way in which they flow, the way in terms of the ways in which they affect the landscapes through processes of erosion and sediment transport, and the creation of a variety of landforms that we're sort of familiar with. And then that sort of, it was as a result of that there was some thought that in permafrost environments that there were blocks of this debris-rich glacier ice that were still present in permafrost environments. So I was invited under a research project to go and look at these masses of ice and try and identify whether these were in fact the remnants of past ice sheets, which had just sat there preserved within the permafrost for 20,000 years or so. And that sort of led to an interest in permafrost environments, in addition to glaciers. And that's kind of got me to the sort of final situation where you think, and you're trying to find out your niche in research. I'm interested in glaciers. I'm interested in permafrost. What kind of where's my niche in terms of research? Glacier permafrost interactions. So my sort of research interest sort of more recently, before talking about this sort of ongoing transition I'm going through at the moment, is looking at the ways in which glaciers and permafrost interact. And if you've got glaciers flowing over permafrost, what are the implications of that for the flow and the behavior of the glacier, but also the ways in which it can kind of create a rather more weird and wonderful set of landforms, which can be different to those you find in textbook examples.
Thank you so much. And it was so nice having those images to kind of see you go through your journey to kind of where you are today. The kind of final question we ask, and we've already kind of included the question that came through as well, is what advice do you give school students? So many students at the moment are kind of deciding if they're in A-levels, kind of what to do in their next stages, degrees or undergraduates. And obviously you work with a lot of students who come up through University of Keele. So what advice would you give to young people who are making the decision on next steps after A-levels?
I mean, at any stage in your career, I'd say, identify and follow your interests. And I think one of the wonderful things about our discipline of geography is it's so diverse, so all-encompassing, that it's almost impossible to conceive of a situation where there's not an area of geography and an area of inquiry, which floats your boat. So, I would encourage anyone in that situation really just to try and identify, what it is that they're really interested in a discipline, and to pursue and follow and develop that interest. Because there's nothing more than I like, in terms of whether it's sort of open day conversations or conversations, whether it be prospective students or students who are on the sort of like the program, is to share someone's enthusiasm, for something. And if you see someone who's got that genuine enthusiasm for something, which they can then sort of showcase, that for me, I think is really powerful. And I guess in a similar vein, the other thing I thought about was is to sort of search out those organizations that work in that particular field that that you're interested in. And we are in this situation now that we're in this hybrid world, probably, that there's that opportunity to engage with those organizations, whether it be sort of like the events, the opportunity to network, there might be some sort of mentors, other people you can make sort of contact with. So sort of expanding your horizons and making those kind of connections with those organizations that reflect the interest that you're developing, I think is probably the other thing which I'd recommend.
And I really like that last point that you're saying too. There are so many different outreach opportunities, or having a look online and seeing kind of what companies were interested in. I think that's a really nice tip for everyone. Thank you so much for being a guest on The Curious Geographer. It has been so fantastic to have you, and it's been so interesting to hear about kind of like your research and like views on it. And I feel like, as you said, when we even like in a year, previously we wouldn't have seen as many, so for example electric cars, and it's definitely like a changing space. So thank you so much for being so informative and just like so interesting and engaging. So for all of us at The Curious Geographer, thank you very much for being a guest on the channel.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks so much for inviting me, and thanks for taking
I'm
part
just
in the
going to
event.
say to everybody, just that is it from our series on this live interview for this term. So kind of have 4 of those live interviews, which I talked about earlier. They're all on the YouTube channel. So definitely check them out if you haven't already. And thank you again